So welcome to another episode of Vendée Radio, and tonight is my very great privilege to welcome Dr. John Rao. Dr. Rao is a professor of history at St. John's University, New York, and he's director of the Roman Forum and the Dietrich von Hildebrand Institute, and he's also a former president of Una Voce America. He has published widely, and he's also the author of various books, including Black Legends and the Light of the World, The War of Words with the Incarnate Word, and Removing the Blindfold, 19th Century Catholics and the Myth of Modern Freedom. And both of those are published by the Remnant Press. Dr. Rao is one of the leading contemporary Catholic historians writing today, and it's my honour to be speaking to him. Dr. Rao, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Well, it's a great pleasure to have you here, and I mentioned to you, your book, Removing the Blindfold, 19th Century Catholics and the Myth of Modern Freedom, and that really speaks to the topic that I'd like to talk to you today about, and that is this extraordinary Catholic revival of the 19th century after the fall of Napoleon. And I know Christopher Dawson talked about the age of revolutions, the 18th century and then the early 19th century, as being like a second Reformation and possibly more damaging. How is it that the Church managed to revitalize after such a damaging period?
Well, there were a number of factors that were involved with it. First of all, and very, very much central to the whole movement of revival, were these small circles of laity and clergy that formed already in the period starting before the French Revolution, but then stirred up still more, stimulated still more by the Revolution and by Napoleon's spread of it around the rest of Europe, who recognized that there had been an abandonment of church practice in the 18th century to a large degree, and that there was a failure on the part of the church authorities and on the part of Catholics in general to really study what the fullness of the faith was all about. They began to do this in these circles that then had a great impact by the time you got into the period that you mentioned before, the period after the fall of Napoleon. They were in a variety of places, in Germany and in France and in Italy and in Spain. Then also there was the very great importance of the suffering of the papacy underneath Napoleon, because both Pius VI and then Pius VII's experiences were something which, because they were suffered with such firmness by both of those popes, they did a great deal towards reviving the prestige of the papacy, not just among Catholics but among non-Catholics as well.
Yeah, that's the sense that I get from reading Christopher Dawson, for example, and he says that the peasantry never really lost the faith in the 18th century. It was, and this is something you pointed out, a sort of an intellectual circles and emanating out into the bourgeoisie, and the church acquired a kind of intellectual respectability in the 19th century. And this coupled with the faith of the lower classes, which had sustained throughout the period of revolution.
Yes, I mean the intellectual prestige of the church that you mentioned is really in the first half of the 19th century, because it suffers with the decline of the influence of Romanticism in the second half of the century,
right
before the scientific onslaught. But in the early part of the century, and again already in the very latter part of the 18th century, the growth of the Romantic movement, once again outside the Catholic Church to begin with, really, was something which contributed mightily to restoring an interest in the Church, and then finding bridges that could be built between the world outside and the world of believers.
It's really interesting you mentioned Romanticism, because I think a lot of historians interpret Romanticism quite rightly as a reaction against the emphasis on classicism and empiricism and rationalism of the Enlightenment. And particularly in Germany, it's been interpreted as a particularly Catholic artistic movement. Do you see it that way?
Well, I mean, that's probably limiting it a bit much. And there's a variety of ways in which the Romantics, whether those who were interested in Catholicism or those who were not reacted against the naturalism of the 19th century, the 18th century, in the way in which they did. A number of them who reacted against it not because of the feeling of the limitations of classicism, but because of the fact that the reduction of naturalism to man's devices alone led a number of those people who were in what we call the Romantic camp to recognize that there was such a diversity in nature that you rapidly reached the point of presuming that there was no way to possibly find any kind of means of making sense out of all of the diversity of wills and clashes of wills and passions that you could find in nature. And therefore, you were led to a despair about the ability to make sense out of what you saw in this rich nature around you. And then this led those people who veered into the Catholic camp to think that perhaps the mistake that had been made by the naturalists in general, whether they went down a classicizing direction or another direction, was to think that they could resolve all of the problems of nature on nature's terms alone. And what that did is that made them retreat to a reconsideration of their whole starting position, and then think that maybe the answer to the problems that they saw in nature's diversity of wills and passions was the reality of a supernatural world whose understanding would make them grasp how to deal with this. So
right.
It was a kind of move from despair to a recognition that the hope had to come from recognizing there was an error in thinking that nature could understand itself in its own terms to begin with.
I see. That's really interesting. So it doesn't, the movement doesn't embrace the fullness of the Catholic faith, the marriage of faith and reason, but it's a kind of emphasis on something the Enlightenment was lacking.
Well, I mean, there was a significant segment of the Romantic movement that does then recognize that the only way that they can understand and appreciate and still, in effect, exult in the incredible diversity of nature was by understanding that nature was made by a creator God, and it was made in a way to allow this diversity to harmoniously work together in the service of God, but that the whole concept of original sin explained how it is that it could also work to the ill as well. So a lot of them saw in the Catholic Church and the Catholic explanation of creation and the fall and then redemption, the only way in which they could maintain their love for the diversity of nature, but understand how it had to be tamed and redirected.
That's really interesting. And another thing I've read is that the church in places like the Palatinate in the late 18th century was in a bad way, and it was very the bishops there were very corrupt, and that actually counterintuitively the destruction wrought by French armies sweeping through and then dismantling the social order of the bishoprics and the Holy Roman Empire actually sowed the ground for the renewal that followed, because it actually got rid of some of those corrupt clergy.
Well, I mean, again, it's a double-edged sword, because Napoleon did an enormous amount of damage.
Yeah.
The greatest damage that was done to the church in Europe was done through Napoleon and Napoleon's empire, and in particular the attack on religious orders that took place with the spread of the Napoleonic system. Because people like Napoleon continued a lot of the secularizing work of the monarchs of the 18th century, in that even if they did not want to get rid entirely of the religious forces around them, they wanted them to serve really as a kind of administrative, spiritual police force for them. Yeah. And anything that went beyond that in the way in which especially religious life would recognize, they didn't want anything to do with. But it is true that, of course, he does then cause or help to cause this reaction, like in the Tyrol, for example, with Andreas Hofer and others of his type elsewhere in the empire.
And since we're on the subject of France, I would like to ask you, Dr. Rao, reading René Raymond and his work on what he calls the right-wing families in France. What's quite interesting about the ultras, they seem there is their spectacular lack of success, really. I mean, the Bourbon Restoration lasts 15 years. What was the reason for the weakness of the return of the alliance between Altar and Throne? Was it an alliance of Altar and Throne in the same way as the Ancien Regime, or was it compromised?
Well, in many respects, what happened was that the worst aspects of the union of Throne and Altar from the latter period of the 18th century were taken for granted and revived. Perhaps it's best that what I do is I discuss the problems of it from the standpoint of the people who are central to the revival. And when you're talking about France, you're talking about Joseph de Maistre more than anyone else.
Yes.
From the standpoint of a man like Joseph de Maistre, the problem with any restoration that did not understand that what needed to be done was to really allow for the fullness of the spiritual life of the church to permeate things was bound to failure. And the spirit of a number of the people behind the restoration, and in this regard, a man like Metternich is the chief example, certainly down through until he begins to change a bit in the 1840s. And the standpoint of a lot of the supporters of the old monarchies and the aristocracy of the old monarchy, what you needed from the church was precisely what people like Napoleon merely intensified, using it as a spiritual police force for you. A man like Louis XVIII was not a model Christian monarch in terms of belief, to say the least. And as a consequence, he represents a lot of the failings of a number of the supporters of the restored monarchy as well. I mean, it included the support for the restored monarchy, a number of people who were aware of the problems and who were more concerned about freeing up the church and allowing it to do its job properly. But quite frankly, in order for the church to do its job properly, you needed more spiritually committed bishops who were more aware of the fact that they had to be leaders of flocks and fighters and not mere administrators. And the episcopacy of the French church under Napoleon and then underneath the restored monarchy as well was very, very much still permeated with this idea of the bishop as a cooperator rather than a spiritual leader.
Gallicanism.
Yes, and not just Gallicanism, but a kind of just unawakened sense of what it would really mean to try to transform things in Christ. And that's why the movement of Catholic renewal very, very quickly became disillusioned with the restored monarchy and wanted something else.
Yeah. And, I mean, when you read the sort of non-Catholic histories of the period, for example, they cite the 1825 anti-sacrilege law as being key to Charles X's overthrow. And this just seems slightly ridiculous. I mean, how could that issue cause people, sort of forces to move to depose the king? What do they find so offensive about it? What was the contents of that law? It seemed pretty justified in giving the religious sensibilities of the French population.
Well, again, when you're talking about the sensibilities of the French population, you're talking about one thing, but when you're talking about who are the influential forces in French society, you're talking about something else.
Right.
And right from the start, when Louis XVIII returned, first in 1814 and then in 1815, he recognized that the bourgeoisie in France had, to a large degree, not entirely, of course, there was a significant Catholic element in the bourgeoisie, but much of the active bourgeoisie, especially those that were active in economic life and that were going to be the forces that were going to propel, especially under the reign of Louis Philippe afterwards, the Industrial Revolution in France, that they were unchurched, and they were, to a large degree, very much against a church that would call the shots in terms of public life in France. Often their wives were believers, but the men were not.
Yes.
And the men were not, and they would have been contented with a church that just simply acted as a force that kept the general population in order. But they weren't content with a church that might actually want to, in some way or another, affect their own lives. And so they did not like this idea of the church, for example, gaining a dominant role in education, particularly with regard to anything involving secondary schools in France. And the sacrilege law was tied together in their minds with the control that the government, at least the government of Charles X, was eager to allow the church to have, the control was eager to allow the church to have over education. So they saw the two of these, stuck together. And then there's another factor that plays an enormous role in the active elements, in affecting or impacting upon the active elements in French political life, who express themselves not just in the economic life of the country through the bourgeoisie, but often through the National Guard, which still existed and played a role, and which the government worried about its impact at times tried to control. But there was a tremendous influence that was played by songs in the Restoration period. And the chief songwriters were anti-clerical and very effective. And their songs were on everyone's lips and coming out of everyone's throats, who would go to a cabaret or would go to a dance hall or who would go to a bar. And in this regard, when you think about that, you think about the way in which even in our own times, people who might be religious, people who might be very much eager to support a Christian way of life, nevertheless, if they go out and sing, will sing and dance to songs which are mocking things that are Catholic. It's very, very much needed, an idea of the importance of the songs of the Restoration period. And songs, operas, all kinds of musical tools were very, very, very powerful in stirring up and aiding revolutionary elements in those decades, the teens, the 20s, the 30s, and onwards. So, it's education in particular that a lot of these people were worried about, and then the way in which church influence might extend into economic matters as well.
Yeah, I think this is one of the black legends that you've done so much good work to uncover, because it's still in most historiography and probably the bulk of the popular imagination, the French Revolution and then the accompanying secularization of Europe was a movement of the popular will. But actually, as you've said, it was actually an elite-driven, elite-manipulated dynamic.
Oh yes, this has always been from the very beginning the case.
Right.
The thing is that it works with this rhetoric that makes it sound as though it's concerned about the triumph of the people, but it's always been the case that what it is it's been an elite which has spoken in the name of the people and crushed any kind of popular opposition to its authority as the voice of the people. I mean, this is in every sphere of revolutionary activity in the late 18th century and in the 19th century.
And I know a lot of Catholic writers have written about the role of Freemasonry in the 18th century. I think it was pretty fundamental to the Enlightenment and the spread of Enlightenment ideas. The philosophe Philippe Egalité being the Grand Master, and as being the nexus by which these anti-royalist ideas were spread and prepared the ground for the revolution. I don't know if you know E. Michael Jones, but he's characterized Masonry as a Whig black operation emanating from Britain. And the 19th century was no different. I mean, lots and lots of historians and people at the time saw the fundamental conflicts between the Church and Freemasonry.
No, right. I do know Mike Jones quite well, and I do agree with him. And the statement that he makes there also indicates, however, one caveat here with regard to the Freemasons, because in general, the Freemasons, at least in the 18th century, were not eager for a radical transformation of society. What they wanted was precisely the Whig transformation of society. However, in mobilizing people for that goal, which also involved, because of the feelings of instability of the Whigs for a good chunk of the 18th century, it also involved an anti-French operation that mobilized on the continent anyone who might be anti-French in character. And what that did is it enabled on the continent of Europe more radical elements that were not Whig in their desire, but were eager for a democratic transformation of society along the lines of Spinoza's visions, to be able to utilize the more moderate Freemasonic structure of things to see if what they could do is manipulate it for their own purposes. So that you have the example, for instance, of the Illuminati in Germany, whose uncovering then frightened the Freemasonic majority to try to squelch what it is that the radicals were doing. And a similar phenomenon happens in the 19th century as well. You've got these moderate Freemasonic groups that are eager for a liberal revolution, a Whig revolution, who nevertheless find that they often shelter more radical elements that they really don't have much in common with. And then by the time you get into the middle of the 19th century, the more radical elements and the more moderate elements have split off into their own powerful but competing Freemasonic groups.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've mentioned this before, but the distinction you make between the moderate Enlightenments, the English and American revolutions, versus the radical Enlightenment, the French and Russian, and as you just mentioned, the competing groups, is very interesting because, you know, one bans worship on Sundays, the other says you can go shopping.
Right.
And both are destructive to the faith ultimately, and I think this is where it's very enlightening, to use a pun, for modern Catholics to understand, you know, how contemporary conservative movements have assimilated these ideas.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So moving into to Spain, I'd like to hear your thoughts on Spain at this period, because it's very interesting. Again, Dawson says that Spain was the most resistant country to the French Revolution. And I find the whole movement of Carlism really fascinating, because it dispels the notion that reaction to the Enlightenment was a right-wing phenomenon, because actually it was based on the fueros, I believe, which were the kind of regional rights and the old ancient sort of feudal structures. Yes,
I mean, Spain's case, and Portugal's, by the way, which in many respects is similar, are very, very interesting. Both of those countries went through already a horrific set of changes in the latter part of the 18th century underneath the influence of monarchs working together with ministers who were Freemasons, who were eager in a Whiggish reinvention of the Spanish and the Portuguese experiences, and who devastated a good chunk of the life of the church in both Spain and Portugal, beginning in Portugal with Pombal in the 1750s, but then moving rapidly into Spain as well. But still, there was a significant amount of resistance that remained, and that flared up enormously because of the Napoleonic assault, and because of that Napoleonic assault. But nevertheless, the Spanish situation in particular is quite complicated because of the variety of groups that were involved in the reaction, and then the odd situation that developed where the only part of Spain that remained free of Napoleonic control down in the south was the part which created a constitution for a new Spain in which a very tiny elite of basically Whiggish liberals created a system that the majority of the Spanish really had no particular interest in, and which nevertheless then at least allowed for an anti-Napoleonic but liberal element with a patriotic flag that it could fly to continue to play a role in the whole situation in the 19th century. But the Carlists are very, very interesting because they demonstrate how much a legitimist movement, because they are, of course, legitimists, was something that that was rooted in a history of a country in a way that demonstrated that legitimism and then the Catholicism that the Carlists became more and more and more the defenders of was something which was not an absolutist phenomenon in the sense that people know of absolutism from the 17th century, 16th century onwards. That it was something that involved a historic constitutionalism and something which was eager in its own way for a limited government, but one that did what a government ought to do in terms of supporting religion and social justice and the like.
So I think there were a number of Carlist wars throughout the 19th century. Why was it that the Carlists were defeated each time? I mean, I know that, for example, British support of the Liberals was, funding and for modern weaponry was pretty important. Did the Carlists have a broad base of support across Spain, or were they isolated in Navarre?
They're not just isolated in Navarre, but they do have specific regions where their influence is the greatest. But I think in general, there are many political peculiarities that mark especially different phases of the different Carlist wars. But I do think that you hit upon something which is extremely important to the whole issue of Carlism in Spain. And to leap to the neighboring country of Portugal and its related history through much of the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries, and just to move into the 20th century to give a guide to what it is that I want to say. In the 20th century in Portugal, with Salazar in control in the 1920s, 30s, and down to the 60s, Salazar pointed out that anything that was done in an Iberian country in the modern world was very, very much going to be conditioned by what it is that the rest of the world allowed it or did not allow it to do. And that's true for Italy as well, in a perhaps maybe a lesser way, but it's true there as well. What happens in Spain, what happens in Portugal, what happens in Italy is very much determined by what it is that England and France and Germany will allow to happen in these various places. But that's just a broad picture. There's very great ins and outs to the whole Carlist story, and the man who could really tell you much more about what it is that that goes on there is a man whose name is Miguel Ayuso from the Pontifical University of Comillas in Madrid, who is really, as far as I'm concerned, the man who is the guide of the traditional Catholic Hispanic world,
right,
constantly on the move, and who's written a number of very fine works, which have been translated into English about the whole Carlist.
Really?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, because I've actually looked for a few Carlist books, and I'll look out for his name as well.
Well, I can send you some titles. Yeah,
that would be excellent. I saw a very interesting book, which was a collection of essays that was comparing Carlism and Polish nationalism in the 19th century. These kind of Catholic movements on Europe's peripheries was the way that it was characterizing it. I thought that was an interesting angle.
There's a difference there, though. There's a tremendous difference there.
Yeah.
Because that Polish nationalist phenomenon is something which has had a history which has been tied in with revolutionary and ideological phenomenon from the outset.
Mm. Well, looking at the continent overall, we have this moment in 1815, the Congress of Vienna, that the ogre of Europe is banished, St. Helena. You've got Metternich, Britain. Everyone's sitting at the table, and they agree to quash liberal and revolutionary ideas and a sort of a form of collective security through the Holy Alliance.
Right.
And it was so short-lived. I mean, I know that you had Britain basically leaving that system under, I always get the two mixed up, Castlereagh or Canning, but it's interesting looking at a figure like Tsar Nicholas I of Russia, because he gets characterized as this kind of reactionary dog on a leash, just waiting with his hordes of Cossacks to just sweep through Europe if there's a revolution. He was itching to suppress, for example, was it the 1830 revolutions, and then in 1848 he actually brings back stability to Hungary. Why wasn't it that this kind of collective security wasn't more effective?
Well, because of the fact that they really never agreed fully on what it is that they were doing, even at the Congress of Vienna. And the inner circle, so to speak, of Prussia and Austria and Russia that then formed the so-called Holy Alliance never had a unity with regard to what that was all about. Right. As I mentioned before, Metternich, for example, Metternich's understanding of what it is that needed to be restored in Europe in the 19th century was one that was tied in until really towards the very, very end of his period of influence in the 1840s. It was very much tied in with the whole concept of Josephism and control of the church, and the presumption that a church was an institution that behaved itself along with and under the guidance of the monarchy. And the whole of the Catholic revival movement that was springing up saw a man like Metternich as its enemy, because a man like Metternich would not allow the church to have the freedom that it needed to really build up an anti-revolutionary, counter-revolutionary movement that would work. Yeah. And then Nicholas the First, the closest that he came to having some sort of guiding principle was the concept that was developed by I think it's his Minister of Education. I forget his name, which is called official nationality. Official nationality, which simply tries to tie together orthodoxy with autocracy and a kind of general anti-revolutionary vision in a way that supporters of a Catholic revival would characterize as part of the problem that brought on the revolution in the first place. So it was even attacked by the papacy itself, the concept of Holy Alliance, as being a kind of mishmash of good anti-revolutionary sentiments with bad policies and understandings of what would really quell a future outburst.
Right, and with it an understanding of the ever-growing power of the state and the centralizing tendencies thereof.
Yeah, you know, the thing which one of the arguments that fuels the Catholic revival, but which also in the period, especially between 1830 and 1848, helped to create confusions that then had to be cleared up after the revolutions of 1848, and were cleared up, or at least work was done to clear them up, beginning in the reign of Pius IX and then moving on down to our current winter of discontent, is that the supporters of the Catholic revival knew that they wanted freedom for the church to go about its work. And as a consequence, one of the clarion calls was freedom of association, and a demand for freedom. And since the word freedom was used by liberals, and it was used by Democrats, and it was used by nationalists, in most places in Europe, the common appeal to the word freedom made Catholics, as well as many liberals, many Democrats, many nationalists, seem as though they had a goal in common, that they were fighting against those who would not allow freedom. Right. And then when the revolutions of 1848 came along, and you went through this very short-lived period of euphoria, so-called springtime of the peoples, when you have these cartoonists depicting everyone from priest to Mazzinian nationalist working together, it became clear that your definition of freedom was very different depending upon whether you were a Catholic, a liberal, a Democrat, a nationalist, or one of the budding, vague variations of what a million different types of people were calling socialism, that you all had different interpretations of what this meant.
We've talked about the political conflict between different states and then the Catholic Church, but the great success story of the 19th century is the great strength of popular piety and spirituality.
Right.
And it's very interesting, you know, something like the monastic revival in France, how that happens and how it's down to quite a small number of men and saints. You know, how is it that after the devastation of the revolutionary period, when the monasteries had all been closed and so many priests had been killed, that the church was able to re-establish itself and exert such faith from the population?
Yeah, well, that's one of the questions that Pope Francis seems to ask himself, as to why so many young people are interested in the traditional mass that they thought had been killed off.
Yeah.
It's again partly the work of these various circles that I mentioned, a number of which overlap the period before the most intense destruction and then the reaction to it. There are ex-Jesuits who always kept alive the devotion to the Sacred Heart. There are again, these circles, as I mentioned, in Italy they're called amicizie cattoliche, Catholic friendship societies, that involve priests who were part of religious orders that were under attack or dissolved, and then laity that were pious, that had close contact with them. There are people that always retained some sort of understanding of what works they should look to, what kinds of pious practices they should cultivate. But what happens is that building upon the existing forces that continue to, in many places, practice these pious devotions, that had been promoted by religious orders that disappeared. And we know that even in the depths of the French Revolution, even in the center of Paris during the Reign of Terror, that there were churches that remained open, and if not opened, there were hidden places where I'm thinking in particular of a number of Jesuits who remained in hiding in Paris during the Revolution, where the commitment to the kind of Catholic life that the Jesuits or other orders had promoted was kept alive. And in these various circles, where it became clear that what needed to be done was to understand more deeply what the incarnation meant, what the mystical body of Christ meant, what effect the walking of God upon the earth had to have upon all aspects of nature, because it couldn't mean nothing for such a thing to happen. From all these circles, there came, in ways that would be too difficult to enumerate here right now, but in the same way that the traditional Mass remained alive and gained an impact over large numbers of young people, and so many young people that, to give you just one example, in the seminary of Dunwoody in the Archdiocese of New York, as far as I know, the large majority of seminarians are very, very eager to celebrate the traditional Mass. Yeah. In various ways, what happened was that all of the different practices that were condemned as superstitious, as outdated, as gone forever from the life of the Church in the late 18th century before the Revolution, even more so with the Revolution, and then underneath Napoleon, all of them just seemed to pop back out of nowhere in the years afterwards. I don't know if you do you know the famous example of the of Trier with the, what is it again? I always forget what it is that they have there. The cape, I think, and the shroud that they. I can't remember. So you have to edit this particular. Look it up. But in Trier, they had a relic that was venerated by the population for centuries upon centuries. But already before the Revolution, this was looked upon as a pointless, distracting, silly, superstitious practice that had to be shelved in honor of what was really important in the Christian life, which is basically what is described by Benjamin Franklin in Poor Richard's Almanac. You know, just going to bed early and washing yourself and making sure you worked and paid your taxes and swept the streets and I mean, really the reduction of the Catholic life to a set of just ordinary practices of the good citizen was promoted by Catholic bishops in especially places like Germany in the late 18th century. But in any case, that disappeared. And then what happened is that the Archbishop of Trier revived the practice in the 1840s. And to the shock of the non-believing and Protestant and liberal elements in Germany, the new railroads that were being built were now utilized to allow hordes of pilgrims that nobody believed actually would exist any longer to come to venerate this relic. And the veneration of the relic in Trier was one of the grand events in the Catholic revival in Germany in the first half of the 19th century, because it overwhelmed even people who were in favor of these practices. They had no idea that I think it is 500,000 people would come to venerate this, because it seemed to them that such things were, if they were against them, dead. Such practices were dead, or if they were in favor of them, they were just starting to be revived. Not that they were there alive and well already.
Yeah, that's incredible, and it seems the complete opposite of liberalism and the revolution in being a true popular movement.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now this is one, I did my doctoral work at Oxford on this famous Jesuit journal called La Civiltà Cattolica, which is now no good. When it was created in 1850, it was designed to gather all of the information about what was being done to revive Catholicism in all parts of Europe and the rest of the world, but then systematically to teach what needed to be done. And what needed to be done, according to the Jesuit editors of La Civiltà Cattolica, was to make the world and the Catholic Church as the teaching force in the world aware that what needed to be understood was the full meaning of the Incarnation, which had been obscured in the life of the Church itself in the 18th century, as Catholics retreated everywhere to a position that was favored by the establishment, the religious establishment in the English world, that viewed religion as a force that really had to just simply, work with the tools of nature in order to demonstrate that the harmonious laws of nature and their exploitation demonstrated that there was a creator God behind it, but not in a way that would really emphasize the sacramental life of the Church, the spiritual life of the Church, the need for the Church to transform a natural world that could be steeped in its own natural abilities to such a degree that would not recognize what its more exalted mission was. That it had to really revive everything that the 18th century had obscured. And this journal, La Civiltà Cattolica, is marvelous for uncovering the elitist character of the revolution. In particular, the arrogant, elite nationalist vision of the Italian nationalist movement that was raising the flag of Italian patriotism in order to build an Italy which was going to destroy everything that Italy had been in the past to recreate it in its own image, in its own new nationalist image. Marvelous uncovering of fraudulent elitism in every kind of realm.
Yeah, it's interesting you mention Italy, because obviously the popes were restored as well in the Papal States in 1815, and I believe, was it the Carbonari? The origin of that word was a group of Masonic radicals who were looking to undermine and overthrow the Pope in his temporal realm there.
Well, the Carbonari were an early manifestation of radical conspiratorial activity in the 18 teens and early 20s, and they were aware. There were different groups of these so-called Carbonari, and they were aware of the need for a conspiratorial organization to create a revolutionary change in Italy. Their actual inspiration came from forces that arrived from France, but again, too, that's a long story. And what ended up happening is that they were crushed. The Carbonari revolutionary organizations, and then their rather pathetic attempts to revolutionize Italy in the late teens and the early 20s. But what was gained by a number of the successors of these movements was a recognition of the need for an ever more creative organizational structure. The need for federative organizational structure, the need to prepare in a way that their earlier efforts had made seem comic compared to what needed to be done. But the memory of the Carbonari as this revolutionary force is something that remained very vivid in the minds of Italians.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. That's what Italian police are called now. It tells you which side won.
Oh, that's actually a different phenomenon. It's a different route.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
No. That's a different route. That refers to their weaponry more than anything.
Okay,
yeah.
That's good.
But the Carbonari are interesting. I think you've come across Billington's book called "Fire in the Minds of Men."
No.
That's James Billington's book, "Fire in the Minds of Men." I can't remember when that was published. Probably in the 80s. Yeah. But he's got a very, very solid discussion of the whole Carbonari movement, which was quite shocking in its character. And you might want to take a look at that because it's really quite extraordinary.
Yes, thank you. I would appreciate that. It's quite interesting. Figures like Thomas Stork, I don't know if you know him, and then E. Michael Jones highlight that the genesis of these liberal revolutionary movements in many ways was a manifestation of economic interests and the desire of certain groups, not the entire bourgeoisie, but certain owners of capital to basically destroy, degrade the church's influence in economic life, things like the Monte della Pietà, usury laws, the guilds were kind of finally destroyed in this. Were destroyed in the revolutionary period. To what extent are there economic motivations here?
Oh, I mean, I think that that's primary in at least giving all revolutionary forces a chance to make their headway. A lot of the more radical movements were not capitalist motivated or bourgeois friendly, as you well know, but they nevertheless needed the revolutionary work that was done by these other forces in order to make headway. I mean, it's what the whole effort of the revolutionary bourgeoisie that wanted both church and state to butt out of its affairs, and then its willingness to overturn the existing order in order to achieve these goals. That work is crucially important to the destruction that was done not just by these people to the life of the church, but to more radical elements that they were not in favor of. It's what's been horrible, which manifested itself at the very beginning of the revolution, but even more so after 1848. What's been, I think, even more horrible in its effects has been the way in which the moderate revolutionary liberal bourgeoisie, after their more clear awareness of the socialist threat due to the outbursts in Paris in 1848, how it is that they have tried and successfully tried, certainly in places like the United States, how they have tried to convince the religious-minded forces that the only revolutionary danger to Christianity is that which comes from socialism, and that what's necessary for Christianity is to join with the liberal bourgeoisie in fighting the only revolutionary enemy, that is the socialists, in a union of a gigantic, what was called in France the Party of Order after 1848, so that you exculpate the bourgeoisie and anything that Whiggish liberalism stands for of any kind of danger. And to a large degree, this has worked because what it has done is it's made many honestly believing Catholics and Protestants think that liberalism is, which they don't call liberalism, they tend to call it conservatism, but it is liberalism. It's the only bulwark against the Reds.
Yep. That is the blindfold that you talk about.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I urge listeners to go out and buy your book, because it's incredibly revealing and insightful about this very issue that's so relevant to our own times.
By the way, I should mention to you the Removing the Blindfold book.
Yeah.
That was I think revised. It was revised, I think, in a better way by myself, and then republished by the Angelus Press a couple of years ago.
Okay.
So if you're looking for the proper edition of that, you've got to look for the Angelus Press's Removing the Blindfold version.
Okay, thank you very much. Is that with any sort of updated chapters, or is it?
I think it's updated in various ways, but I think that I added an epilogue, or I updated the epilogue. I haven't looked at it for a while, but I know I definitely added material to the end of the book.
Yeah.
So yes, that's true.
Excellent. Well, this just as a final question, this Catholic revival that you've been talking about, in many ways was sustained and until the Second Vatican Council,
right?
And it spread particularly to the United States with the immigrant communities there, and had its moments in Latin America as well. But increasingly in the late 19th century, it was subverted by internal forces within the church, which came to be known as modernism.
Right.
Could you see any sort of potential future revival, after a revolutionary period that we're experiencing at the moment, that could again be something that comes as a result of, or is expressed through popular devotions, and is successful in circumventing the interests of the revolutionary elites?
Oh no! First of all, it's already happening. Right. It's already happening. The Catholic world today, compared to when I first entered this whole movement, when I was a kid, really, an 18-year-old, in 1969, there's a much more self-conscious Catholic movement than anything that I knew at that time period. And of course, with the aid of things like, it can be a disaster in its own realm, the internet. But with the aid of these kinds of communications, there have been speedy ways in which all of the different groups that are operating around the world have come into contact with one another, and sometimes one is surprised to discover the existence of groups that you never dreamed could possibly have come into being. I'll give you one example. Some years ago, this is very, very instructive and amusing in this regard, and it was through Mike Jones actually that that I put in contact with this group. Mike Jones and some other people as well. But in Estonia, there was a man in Estonia, a musician, who had a very, very, he was young at the time, but he had a very fine career in Estonia when it was still part of the Soviet Union. And his field was medieval music and early modern music. And through the realm of music, this man discovered the faith. He discovered faith. And this is in Estonia. Yeah. Before the Soviet takeover, it had a very minor Catholic presence. It had a Lutheran presence, and it had a certain Orthodox presence, but a very, very minor Catholic presence. And I think the Estonian example is an instructive one, because here is this man who, through one realm, music, and the spiritual questions that someone connected with music can easily be led to want to explore, especially when you want to discover the entire historical context of the period of music, the medieval period, which was Catholic in the latter part of the Middle Ages in Estonia, can want to explore. And so he discovered Catholicism. And when he discovered Catholicism, he immediately recognized that the only Catholicism that made any sense was traditional Catholicism.
Right.
So he converted to Catholicism and connected with traditional movements in Catholicism. Now, because of this, but this all is illustrative of the numerous unexpected ways that things can revive. Because of his discovery of religion, he was drummed out of his quite serious musical position in the old Soviet Union, and suffered for his faith. But then the Soviet Union collapsed, and the Estonian government, which wanted to be able to work with people who had a reputation but had suffered under the Soviets, immediately saw that this man was one of the people that they should entrust the musical revival of Estonia to. What they did is the new government of Estonia gave to this man a position and a place to work from, which was the old it was very run down, but it had been the Dominican center in the center of Tallinn, where the conversion of Estonia was being worked out in the 1200s. They gave him this as a headquarters, and with state support, he began to build up an entire artistic network of music and art and other things in the capital, but with a traditionalist Catholic structure to it. A school was set up, and the school that was set up became a center for the Right to Life movement in Tallinn. And this man then began to create all kinds of major international meetings in Tallinn, where he invited people like Mike Jones and myself to. Eventually, the government of Estonia and the church realized what was going on here, and he lost that support. Right. But the man became a center for conversion of a number of people in Estonia that gave to the newly reviving Estonian Catholic Church a major traditionalist element.
That's amazing.
It's this kind of way that the things can revive. Well, let me add one other thing that I myself am going to have to take off here.
Yes, of course. Yep.
Well, but I think this is all, again, very instructive as to how these things work out. This little group in Estonia of traditionally minded people who were creating an international artistic network that, again, they were inviting people aside from the religious issue, they were inviting theatrical people, artistic people, musical people to these 1-2 week conferences with productions of all sorts in Tallinn in the fall every year, in a way that had its own artistic merit to it. But for the intellectual side of it, they were concerned that they weren't seeing the whole picture. And they went off on a retreat, a number of the leaders of this thing, to a monastery in Norway, a tiny monastery in Norway, a traditional monastery in Norway, with, I think, 2 monks in it. I can't remember how many. But the head of it was this monk, traditional monk, from the United States. Yeah. And they went and they told him they're concerned that they were not seeing the whole picture. And the traditional monk from the monastery in Norway, tiny monastery in Norway, said to them, well, why don't you invite John Rao to give some historical talks? Because he had listened to tapes of mine. Yeah. Now, that's how I got invited. And Mike Jones was the intermediary for
really?
Wow. Yeah, so I mean, how does this thing rebuild? Well, I mean, Providence, but
of course.
From any number of unexpected ways. Quite extraordinary.
Yeah. And just as a final note, I think the fact that the liberal revolutionaries who run the Western world are, ever more clearly growing, ever more hostile explicitly to the Catholic faith. The honeymoon is over. People realise it's a clarifying moment for people where they realise that they have to sort of peel back the curtain, as you said, and actually understand the entire universal aspects of their faith.
Yes. Well, let's hope that current events will aid this whole thing enormously.
Amen. Yeah, it's history happening in real time, definitely.